Jake Foster gripped the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck as the wheels bounced over another pothole. The Arizona desert stretched around him like an endless sea of sand and stone, the sun mercilessly beating down through the windshield. He winced in pain as his right leg, still in an orthopedic boot, slipped off the gas pedal. 4 months after the rodeo accident, and the pain still hadn't let up. Just like the memories. "This is it," he muttered to himself as he spotted the tilted wooden sign with the barely visible inscription, Sunny Valley Ranch. Jake turned onto the dirt road and slowly moved toward the half-ruined house that appeared on the horizon. Here, among the red rocks and saguaro cacti, he was planning to start all over again. 15 years of rodeo had ended in a moment when the enraged bull, Devil's Dancer, threw him off and trampled him in front of thousands of spectators. The doctors said he would never compete again. Well, now he had a new plan: to use all his savings to transform this abandoned ranch into a sanctuary for horses. The truck came to a stop in front of a weathered, single-story house. Jake sat motionless for a moment, taking in his new property. The main house needed serious repairs: broken windows, a sagging porch, and what looked like a partially collapsed roof on one side. About 100 yards away stood a large barn in slightly better condition, and beyond it were the remains of several corrals with broken fencing. It wasn't much, but it was his, all 200 acres of it. The realtor had called him crazy when he'd insisted on buying this place sight unseen. "There's no water for miles," she'd warned. But Jake had done his research. The property had an old well that, according to the previous land surveys, was still viable. If he could get that working again, he'd have everything he needed to make this place livable. Jake stepped out of the truck, grimacing as his injured leg took his weight. The dry desert air immediately enveloped him, and he pulled his hat lower over his eyes. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead and the soft ticking of his truck's cooling engine. After years of crowd noise, announcers, and the constant commotion of the rodeo circuit, the quiet felt almost oppressive. He limped to the back of his pickup and lowered the tailgate. The truck bed was filled with supplies, tools, some lumber, a generator, food, and water to last until he could make the well operational. His entire life had been reduced to what could fit in a pickup truck. "Well, no point standing around," Jake said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the vast emptiness. He grabbed a toolbox and headed toward the house, determined to at least secure one room before nightfall. The inside of the house was worse than the outside: dust, debris, and what looked like decades of neglect. In one corner, a pack rat had built an elaborate nest using bits of the disintegrating furniture. Jake sighed. This was going to be more work than he'd anticipated, but he was no stranger to hard labor. By sunset, Jake had managed to clear and partially repair one room. He boarded up the broken window, swept out years of accumulated dirt, and set up a camp cot. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sitting on the front porch with a can of beans heating on his portable stove, he watched as the desert transformed. The harsh daytime landscape softened as the setting sun painted the rocky outcroppings and distant mountains in hues of gold and purple. For the first time since the accident, Jake felt a sense of peace settling over him. His leg throbbed, but it was a familiar pain now, almost a companion. Tomorrow he would tackle the well and start assessing what it would take to repair the corrals. If all went according to plan, he could start accepting horses within a month. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the evening stillness. Jake tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his hip, where he used to keep his competition knife. Headlights appeared on the dirt road, bouncing and weaving as the vehicle navigated the rough terrain. A few minutes later, a dusty SUV pulled up beside his truck. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans, boots, and a light jacket against the evening chill. Something about her posture, confident, slightly defensive, told Jake she wasn't just passing through. "Can I help you?" Jake called, not bothering to stand. His leg wouldn't appreciate the extra effort anyway. "I should be asking you that," she replied, approaching the porch with measured steps. "I'm Maria Reyes. I own the property that borders yours to the east." She gestured vaguely toward the rising moon. "Saw the truck pass by earlier. Didn't realize anyone had bought this place." Jake introduced himself, offering a brief handshake. "Just moved in today, planning to turn it into a sanctuary for retired and abused horses." Maria's eyebrows rose slightly. "A horse sanctuary? Out here?" She looked around at the dilapidated buildings and overgrown land. "That's ambitious." "I've been called worse," Jake replied with a half smile. He gestured to the empty crate beside him. "Care to sit? I can offer you lukewarm coffee or room temperature water. Finest accommodations in all of Copper Canyon." She hesitated, then took a seat. "Water's fine, thanks." As Jake handed her a bottle, Maria studied him more carefully. "You're that rodeo rider, aren't you? The one who got trampled by Devil's Dancer last season. I thought I recognized you." Jake stiffened. He hadn't expected his past to catch up with him so quickly. "Former rodeo rider," he corrected, tapping his booted leg. "Career change." "Sorry about what happened," she said, and to her credit, she didn't offer the platitudes most people did. "So why here? There are easier places to start over." Jake took a swig of his coffee before answering. "Needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could stretch my savings, and somewhere with enough land." He looked out at the darkening desert. "Always loved horses more than the competition anyway. Figure I owe them something after all these years." Maria nodded, seeming to accept his answer. "Well, you should know what you're getting into. This isn't friendly country. Water's precious out here, and your well might not be as reliable as you hope. Summers are brutal. Winters can be too. And the locals don't exactly welcome newcomers with open arms." "Except you?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "I'm just being neighborly," she replied with a small shrug, "and maybe a little curious. We don't get many new faces around here." She paused, taking a sip of water. "Especially ones planning to bring in a bunch of horses." They talked as the stars emerged, Maria telling him about the small town 15 miles away, the nearest supplies, which roads became impassable during the infrequent but violent desert rainstorms. Jake found himself appreciating her straightforward manner and practical advice. There was something refreshing about someone who didn't tiptoe around his injury or his change in fortune. As Maria stood to leave, her phone buzzed. She frowned at the screen, then looked at Jake with a sudden intensity. "You said you're starting a sanctuary?" At his nod, she continued, "How soon were you planning to take in horses?" "Once I get the corrals fixed and a water source secured." "Why?" She held up her phone. "That was my friend from the county sheriff's office. They just broke up an illegal mustang capture operation about 30 miles from here. Poachers catching wild horses to sell to slaughterhouses in Mexico. They've got one stallion they seized, badly injured, completely wild. They can't find a place to take him, and the county doesn't have facilities." She paused. "They'll probably put him down if they can't place him." Jake felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before the accident. Purpose. Challenge. "I'm not ready," he said slowly. "Corrals aren't secure. I don't have proper feed. Nothing." "But?" Maria prompted, a knowing look in her eyes. Jake sighed, already knowing he was going to agree. "But I can't let them put him down when I've got 200 acres here." He stood up, wincing as his leg protested. "Tell them I'll take him. I'll work through the night to secure at least part of the corral." Maria smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "I'll help. My truck has some fencing materials, and I know how to mend a corral." Before Jake could protest, she added, "That's what neighbors do out here. We help when it's needed, because someday we'll be the ones needing help." As she made the call to her friend at the sheriff's office, Jake looked out at his dilapidated property in the moonlight. 24 hours ago, he'd been in a motel room in Phoenix, questioning every decision that had led him to this point. Now, he was preparing to take in his first rescue, a wild, injured Mustang that would probably fight him every step of the way. For the first time in months, Jake Foster felt alive again. The transport trailer arrived at dawn, kicking up dust clouds that glowed orange in the early morning light. Jake had been awake all night, working alongside Maria to reinforce a section of the corral. His leg throbbed mercilessly, but he'd refused to rest. The knowledge that a life hung in the balance had kept him going. "They're here," Maria called, from where she was hammering in the last fence post. Her face was streaked with dirt, her ponytail disheveled. But she looked satisfied with their night's work. Jake limped over to the entrance of the property as the sheriff's truck and trailer pulled in. The driver, a weathered man in his 50s, with a tan uniform and a worn expression, nodded curtly at Jake. "You Foster?" he asked, climbing down from the cab. "I'm Deputy Collins. Maria said you'd take this Mustang off our hands." He glanced skeptically at the hastily repaired corral. "You sure about this? This isn't some broken-down rodeo horse. He's wild, dangerous." Before Jake could answer, a powerful kick rattled the trailer, making everyone jump. The deputy grimaced. "Been doing that the whole way. Nearly turned us over twice." Jake approached the trailer, careful to stay out of kicking range. Through the slats, he caught glimpses of movement, a dark form, powerful muscles, tensing and releasing with each impact against the trailer wall. His heart quickened. Despite everything, horses still had that effect on him. "I'll take him," Jake said firmly, though his stomach tightened with apprehension. The deputy shrugged. "Your funeral." He handed Jake a clipboard with paperwork. "Sign here. He's officially seized property of the county, being transferred to your custody. Legally, he's yours now." Jake signed the forms, his signature a scrawl across the line. Maria joined them, her eyes darting between Jake and the trailer. "Let's get this done before he demolishes my trailer," the deputy said, walking around to the back. "I'll open the gate, and he'll bolt straight ahead. Make sure that corral of yours is secure." Jake and Maria positioned themselves on either side of the direct path from trailer to corral, forming a human funnel. Jake's pulse raced. With his injured leg, he couldn't move quickly if the horse decided to charge him instead of running for the corral. "Ready?" the deputy called, his hand on the latch. Jake nodded, bracing himself. The deputy swung the gate open and quickly stepped aside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a dark whirlwind, the stallion burst from the trailer. Jake caught only flashes: midnight black coat, wild eyes, a streaming mane, as the horse thundered past him. The ground shook beneath his feet. The Mustang was larger than he'd expected, probably 16 hands high, with the lean, powerful build of a horse that had spent its life running free. The stallion charged directly into the corral, exactly as planned. Maria rushed forward to close the gate, securing it with a length of chain, just as the horse wheeled around, realizing his containment. He reared up, front hooves pawing at the air, and let out a piercing neigh that sent birds scattering from nearby cacti. "Lord Almighty," breathed the deputy, "that there is the devil himself." Now that the horse was contained, Jake could get a proper look at him. The Mustang was indeed coal black, with only a small white star between his eyes. His coat was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood on his left flank. Despite his injuries and obvious exhaustion, he continued to circle the corral, testing the fence with occasional lunges. "What happened to him?" Jake asked, not taking his eyes off the horse. "Poachers had him lassoed," the deputy explained. "He fought so hard he damn near killed himself. Took down 2 of their horses in the process. One of the poachers got trampled. Broken leg, maybe worse. That's how we found them. Heard the screaming from the highway." Jake watched the Mustang pace, noting his uneven gait, favoring his right front leg. Not broken, he thought, but definitely injured. The wound on his flank looked painful, but superficial. "He needs a vet," Jake said, concern overriding his earlier apprehension. "Good luck getting anyone near him," the deputy snorted. "County vet took one look and said he wasn't going in that trailer for love or money." "I know someone," Maria offered. "Specializes in difficult cases. I'll give her a call." The deputy left soon after, clearly relieved to be rid of his dangerous cargo. Jake stood by the corral fence, watching as the stallion finally stopped running and stood at the furthest corner, sides heaving, eyes never leaving the humans. "What are you going to call him?" Maria asked, coming to stand beside Jake. Jake didn't hesitate. "Spirit," he said, the name coming to him instinctively. "Wild Spirit." The vet, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Esther Chen, arrived later that afternoon. After one look at Spirit, who was still pacing restlessly despite his obvious exhaustion, she shook her head. "We'll need to tranquilize him," she said, preparing a dart gun. "It's the only way I can examine him safely." Jake didn't like the idea, but he recognized the necessity. The dart found its mark on Spirit's hindquarters, and the stallion reacted with fury, charging around the corral before gradually slowing as the sedative took effect. Even in his drugged state, his eyes remained wary, tracking their movements as they cautiously entered the corral. Dr. Chen worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound on Spirit's flank, treating his injured leg, and checking for other injuries. "He's dehydrated, exhausted, and has some nasty rope burns, but nothing that won't heal," she concluded, packing up her supplies. "The real challenge will be getting him to eat and drink. And trust me, you don't want to sedate him every time." "I won't," Jake said firmly. "We'll do this the slow way." After the vet left, Jake set up a lawn chair near the corral, close enough to observe Spirit, but far enough to avoid causing him additional stress. As dusk fell, Maria brought him a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. "You don't have to stay," Jake told her, surprised by her continued presence. "You've already done more than enough." She shrugged, pulling up another chair. "I've got nothing better to do. Besides, I want to see how this plays out. Not every day you get to watch a wild Mustang taming." "Who said anything about taming?" Jake asked. "I'm running a sanctuary, not a training stable." Maria raised an eyebrow. "You still need to be able to treat him, feed him, unless you plan to dart him every time." Jake didn't respond, his attention drawn back to Spirit, who was now cautiously approaching the water trough they'd installed. The horse sniffed the water suspiciously, then took a tentative drink before retreating back to his corner. Small victories, Jake murmured. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell. Jake found himself appreciating Maria's quiet presence. She didn't feel the need to fill the air with constant chatter, a trait he'd always valued. "So what's your story?" he finally asked. "What brings a woman like you out to the middle of nowhere?" Maria was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was measured, careful. "I'm a wildlife biologist," she said. "Specifically, I study desert ecosystem restoration. I bought my land 5 years ago to conduct field research." She took a sip of her coffee. "The isolation suits my work. And me." "So you're not just a helpful neighbor," Jake said, with a hint of a smile. "You're Dr. Reyes." "Just Maria out here," she corrected. "But yes, I have credentials. And speaking of my professional opinion," she nodded toward the darkening horizon, "we've got a storm coming." Jake followed her gaze. Sure enough, the distant sky was turning an ominous purple-black. The air had taken on that peculiar stillness that precedes a desert storm. "How bad?" he asked, suddenly concerned about Spirit's exposure to the elements. "Flash flood potential," she replied. "When it hits, it'll hit hard. Spirit should be okay in the corral. It's on high enough ground, but you might want to get inside." Jake shook his head. "I can't leave him alone during his first storm here. He's already traumatized." Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then we'll need a shelter. Wait here." She returned to her SUV and pulled out what looked like camping gear, a large tarp and collapsible poles. With efficient movements, she began setting up a makeshift shelter near the corral. "You camp a lot?" Jake asked, rising to help despite his protesting leg. "Field research," she reminded him. "I've spent more nights under the stars than in a bed these past few years." They had just finished securing the shelter when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle patter turned into a deafening downpour. Lightning slashed across the sky, followed immediately by ground-shaking thunder. In the corral, Spirit panicked. He reared and neighed, then began running in tight circles, his hooves sending mud flying. When a particularly bright lightning bolt cracked directly overhead, he charged straight for the fence. "No!" Jake yelled, certain the horse would injure himself on the newly repaired barrier. But at the last moment, Spirit veered away, skidding in the mud. He repeated this pattern, charging toward freedom only to turn away at the last second, as if warring with himself. "He's going to hurt himself," Maria said, raising her voice over the storm. Jake nodded grimly. He knew horses, knew how their panic could drive them to self-destruction. Without thinking, he left the shelter and limped toward the corral gate. "What are you doing?" Maria called after him. "Trust me," he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he trusted himself. The rain soaked him instantly, plastering his shirt to his skin and making his injured leg slip in the mud. At the corral gate, Jake took a deep breath. Then, in a move that went against all common sense, he unlatched it and slipped inside, shutting it behind him. Spirit froze, his eyes reflecting the lightning as he stared at the human who had entered his space. Jake didn't move toward the horse. Instead, he simply stood there, rain streaming down his face, his body relaxed despite the thundering of his heart. Another lightning bolt struck, and Spirit flinched, but didn't run. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "It's just noise. It can't hurt you." He continued speaking, the words almost meaningless, just a constant, soothing stream of sound. Gradually, improbably, Spirit's frantic movements slowed. The horse still trembled, still watched Jake with wary eyes, but the blind panic had receded. When another thunderclap boomed overhead, Spirit startled but didn't bolt. Instead, he took a hesitant step toward Jake, as if the human might somehow offer protection from the terrifying sky. Jake remained still, hardly daring to breathe. Spirit took another step forward, then another. They stood less than 10 feet apart now, a distance that could be closed in a single leap if the horse decided to attack. "That's it," Jake murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a brief, incredible moment, horse and man regarded each other through the curtain of rain, two injured beings finding unexpected connection in the midst of a storm. Then, a tremendous crack split the air as a nearby saguaro was struck by lightning. Spirit reared in renewed panic, his front hooves dangerously close to Jake's head. Jake stumbled backward, his injured leg giving way in the slippery mud. He fell hard, pain shooting up from his knee to his hip. Before he could scramble away, Spirit's hooves came down, missing Jake's chest by inches. The horse snorted and backed away, confusion replacing fear in his wild eyes. "Jake!" Maria was at the fence, her knuckles white on the wooden rails. "Can you get out?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He remained on the ground, pain keeping him immobile. Spirit circled him warily, occasionally lowering his head to sniff the air in Jake's direction. "I'm okay," Jake finally called back, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just give me a minute." Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself to his feet, careful not to make any sudden movements. Spirit retreated further, but didn't resume his panicked running. The storm was beginning to move off, the thunder now a distant rumble. Jake limped to the gate, keeping his eyes on Spirit the entire time. As he slipped out of the corral, he felt a strange reluctance, as if leaving now would undo the tentative connection they'd established. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen," Maria said, helping him back to the shelter. Her voice was angry, but her hands were gentle as she examined his leg. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Jake pointed out, watching as Spirit cautiously approached the water trough again, drinking deeply this time. "And look, he's calmer now." Maria shook her head in exasperation. "You rodeo guys are all the same. One brain cell, and it's dedicated to finding new ways to get trampled." Jake laughed, surprising himself. "Pretty much, but sometimes it works out." They spent the night under the shelter, taking turns keeping watch over Spirit. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. The normally dusty earth was briefly green and vibrant, small desert flowers already pushing up through the mud. Spirit stood quietly in a corner of the corral, his coat gleaming black in the morning sun. "Thank you," Jake said as Maria packed up her gear. "I couldn't have done this without you." She waved away his gratitude. "That's what neighbors are for. Besides, I've got a vested interest now. I want to see how this turns out." She paused, looking at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "But you should know something. There's a reason I was so quick to help you." Jake waited, sensing something important was coming. "Those developers I mentioned yesterday, they're not just after any land. They want this whole valley, including your property and mine." Jake frowned. "For what?" "Resort development," Maria explained, her expression hardening. "Golf courses, luxury homes, the works. They need water, which is why they're particularly interested in your well and the aquifer beneath this valley. They've been buying up properties for the past year, and they're not above using pressure tactics when people won't sell. Jake thought about his dilapidated ranch, the work he'd already put into it, and the purpose it would serve. "I'm not selling," he said firmly. "I don't care what they offer." Maria's smile was grim. "That's what I said too. But be prepared. They'll be coming around once they hear this place is occupied again." She shouldered her bag. "I'm glad you're here, Jake. And not just because you're giving that horse a chance." After she left, Jake returned to his post by the corral. Spirit watched him approach, ears forward with interest rather than flattened in fear. Progress, though minimal. "So we've both got fights ahead of us," Jake said quietly to the horse. "You with your trust issues, me with these developers. Plus this leg that doesn't work right, and a ranch that's falling apart." He chuckled humorlessly. "Quite a pair we make." Spirit snorted, as if in agreement, then cautiously approached the fence where Jake stood. He stayed just out of reach, but that he approached at all felt like a victory. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake felt a strange sense of peace despite the new challenges Maria had revealed. For the first time since his accident, he had purpose again. And as he watched the wild Mustang tentatively accept his presence, Jake knew he'd found exactly where he was meant to be. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake fell into a routine. Mornings were dedicated to ranch repairs, fixing the roof, repairing windows, making the house habitable. Afternoons belonged to Spirit. He spent hours simply sitting by the corral, sometimes reading aloud from whatever book he had on hand. Other times, just talking softly about his plans for the sanctuary. Spirit remained wary, but grew accustomed to Jake's presence, no longer retreating to the far corner whenever the man approached. Progress came in small, almost imperceptible steps. The day Spirit took an apple slice from Jake's outstretched palm, snatching it quickly before backing away, felt like winning the National Rodeo Championship all over again. "You've got away with him," Maria remarked during one of her frequent visits. She'd taken to stopping by every few days, sometimes bringing supplies, other times just checking in. Today, she'd arrived with a stack of books on horse behavior and natural horsemanship. Jake glanced up from where he was sitting cross-legged by the fence, Spirit grazing a few yards away. "He's doing all the work, really. I'm just being patient." Maria settled beside him, careful not to make sudden movements that might startle the horse. Patience isn't exactly a common trait among rodeo riders. "Former rodeo rider," Jake corrected with a faint smile, repeating his now familiar refrain. "And I've got nothing but time these days." That wasn't entirely true. Jake's savings were dwindling faster than he'd anticipated. The well had required extensive repairs, costing nearly twice his initial estimate. The house needed more work than he'd thought, and his physical limitations meant some tasks took him 3 times as long as they should. And then there was the feed for Spirit, the veterinary bills, and the never-ending list of supplies needed to prepare for additional horses. But Jake kept these concerns to himself. He'd made his choice, and he wasn't about to back down now. "I got a call from my contact at the rescue network," he told Maria, changing the subject. "They've got 3 horses that need placement. An ex-racehorse with a bowed tendon, an elderly quarter horse whose owner died, and a pony that was seized in an animal cruelty case." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Are you ready for that many?" Jake shrugged. "I've got the big corral nearly finished. I can section it off to keep them separated until they get used to each other. The barn has enough stalls now, and the water troughs are set up." He paused, watching his Spirit cautiously approach the fence line nearest them. "Besides, Spirit might do better with some company. Horses are herd animals. What about Spirit's corral? You can't exactly put newcomers in with him. I thought I'd let him keep this one as his private space for now, Jake explained. He's used to it, and he can see the others from here. Get used to them gradually. Maria seemed to approve of this plan. Sounds like you've thought it through. She hesitated, then added, there's something else we should talk about. I've been hearing rumors in town. Sunrise Development Corporation has been meeting with the county commissioners. They're pushing for zoning changes that would make it easier to develop this area. Jake frowned. Can they do that? They can try. Money talks in Copper County. Especially now that the mines are mostly played out and tourism is down. Maria pulled a folded newspaper from her back pocket. There's a town meeting next week. Thought you might want to go. Jake took the paper, scanning the announcement. I'll be there, he promised. Though the thought of facing a crowd made his stomach tighten. He hadn't been around many people since the accident. The day the new horses arrived was chaotic but exhilarating. The transport pulled in around midday, and Jake spent the afternoon settling the newcomers into their spaces. The ex-racehorse, a tall bay gelding named Flash, was high-strung and anxious, constantly pacing his new enclosure. The elderly quarter horse, Rusty, seemed resigned and quiet, cautiously exploring his surroundings. The pony, a small piebald named Oreo, was initially fearful, but within hours was curiously investigating everything within reach. Spirit watched the proceedings from his corral, ears pricked forward in interest. Jake noticed him running along the fence line, adjacent to the newcomers, snorting and tossing his head, not in aggression, but in what appeared to be excitement. He's showing off, Maria observed, helping Jake distribute hay to the new arrivals. Like a kid with new neighbors, trying to impress them. Jake smiled, watching as Spirit pranced along the fence, his movements more animated than Jake had seen before. He's looking better physically too. The limp is almost gone. The sanctuary suddenly felt more alive, more like the vision Jake had been nurturing. That night, exhausted but satisfied, he sat on his porch and listened to the occasional soft nickers from the barn, the rhythmic sound of horses moving in their enclosures. For the first time since moving to the ranch, he felt less alone. The next morning, Jake woke early to check on the horses. All seemed well, with the newcomers settling in nicely. He saved Spirit for last, bringing a special treat of carrots and apple slices. To his surprise and concern, Spirit wasn't in his usual spot. Jake scanned the corral, his heart rate accelerating when he didn't immediately spot the black Mustang. Then he noticed the fence. A section on the far side had been broken, the rails splintered outward as if struck by tremendous force. "Spirit!" Jake called, panic rising in his throat. He limped quickly around the corral, searching for signs of the horse's direction. Had Spirit been frightened by something? Had he decided to return to the wild now that other horses had arrived? Jake was about to head back to the house to call Maria when he heard a familiar snort. Turning, he saw Spirit, not running free across the desert, but standing by the fence of the larger corral, nose to nose with Rusty, the elderly quarter horse. Relief flooded through Jake. Spirit hadn't fled. He'd simply wanted to get closer to the newcomers. As Jake approached, Spirit turned to look at him, ears forward, no sign of the fear that had characterized their early interactions. Jake stopped a few yards away, unsure how to proceed. The Mustang was outside his enclosure, technically free. Would trying to lead him back undo all their progress? "Hey, Spirit," Jake said softly, extending a hand with a carrot. "Decided to meet the neighbors up close, huh?" To his amazement, Spirit walked toward him, not with the hesitancy of before, but with confident steps. The Mustang took the carrot from his hand and stood quietly while Jake gently touched his neck. Their first real physical contact without a barrier between them. Jake's throat tightened with emotion. It was a breakthrough moment, born not of his training techniques, but of Spirit's own choice. "What do you say we fix that fence and then see about letting you meet everyone properly?" Jake suggested, running his hand along Spirit's glossy neck. The horse snorted, as if in agreement. Later, after repairing the fence, Jake decided to take a risk. Instead of trying to separate Spirit from the others, he opened the gate between the corrals, allowing for supervised interaction. The horses sniffed and circled each other, establishing their hierarchy. To Jake's relief, there was minimal conflict. Spirit seemed content to let Rusty take the role of herd leader, while asserting dominance over Flash and Oreo. By evening, the four horses were grazing together peacefully. Jake watched from the fence, a sense of satisfaction warming him, despite the cool desert evening. "Looks like your sanctuary is officially up and running," Maria said, arriving with supplies and pausing to observe the horses. "4 rescues already. Not bad for a month's work." Jake smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "If I can keep it going, these repairs are eating through my savings faster than I expected." He hadn't meant to voice his concern, but Maria was becoming someone he could be honest with. She frowned. "Have you thought about applying for grants? There's funding available for animal welfare organizations." "I've looked into it. Most require nonprofit status, which means paperwork, a board of directors." Jake shook his head. "I came out here to get away from complications, not create new ones." Maria considered this, then said, "What about social media? People love animal rescue stories. You could share updates about Spirit and the others. Maybe even set up a donation page." Jake grimaced. "I'm not big on social media. Never have been." "You don't have to be. I could help," Maria offered. "Just simple posts, before and after photos, progress updates. People eat that stuff up, especially when it involves wild horses." Before Jake could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A sleek black SUV was coming up the drive, raising dust clouds in its wake. "Were you expecting someone?" Maria asked, her posture suddenly tense. Jake shook his head, moving toward the driveway. The vehicles that came out this way were usually trucks or jeeps suited for the rough terrain. A luxury SUV was unusual. The SUV came to a stop, and a man stepped out, tall, in his 40s, wearing an expensive-looking suit that seemed wildly out of place in the dusty desert setting. He surveyed the property with the critical eye of someone assessing value, not beauty. "Mr. Foster?" he called, approaching with an extended hand. "I'm Richard Dawson, Senior Development Director with Sunrise Corporation." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by for a chat." Jake didn't take the offered hand. "How did you know my name?" Dawson's smile didn't falter. "It's my job to know who owns what in this valley." He glanced around, taking in the renovated house, the corrals, the horses. "I see you've been busy since acquiring the property. Started some kind of horse farm?" "It's a sanctuary," Jake corrected, "for rescued horses." "How charitable," Dawson replied, his tone suggesting he found the venture quaint at best. His gaze shifted to Maria, and his expression changed subtly. "Dr. Reyes, always a pleasure. Still holding on to your piece of the desert, I see?" "Mr. Dawson," Maria acknowledged coolly, "still trying to pave paradise?" The developer chuckled, as if she'd made a clever joke. "Progress isn't the enemy, Doctor. Our eco-resort will bring jobs and prosperity to Copper County, and we're committed to sustainable development practices. What exactly do you want, Mr. Dawson? Jake interrupted, disliking the man's smooth talking and the way he looked at the land, as if mentally replacing the sanctuary with swimming pools and golf greens. Dawson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, offering it to Jake. I want to make you an offer. Sunrise Corporation is interested in acquiring strategic properties in this valley. Your land, particularly with its well and water rights, is of specific interest to us. Jake didn't take the card. Not interested. You haven't heard the offer, Dawson said, his smile tightening around the edges. We're prepared to pay substantially above market value, enough for you to relocate your sanctuary to a more suitable location, perhaps somewhere with better access to veterinary services and supplies. This location suits us fine, Jake replied, crossing his arms. He noticed Spirit watching from the corral, head high, alert to the stranger's presence. Dawson's gaze followed Jake's to the horses. Beautiful animals, he remarked, eyes lingering on Spirit. Particularly that black one. Unusual to see a Mustang that striking. He turned back to Jake, his expression calculating. I understand you have financial concerns about maintaining this place. Our offer could solve those problems. Jake stiffened. How did Dawson know about his financial situation? He glanced at Maria, who looked equally surprised. My finances aren't your concern, Jake said coldly, and my answer is still no. The developer shrugged, placing his card on a fence post. Think about it, Mr. Foster. Development is coming to this valley whether individual landowners cooperate or not. The county is eager for new tax revenue, and the zoning changes we've proposed will likely pass next week. He gestured to the surrounding landscape. Soon you'll have luxury homes and golf courses as neighbors. Property taxes will rise, water restrictions will tighten. Running a horse sanctuary will become challenging. His smile returned, slick and confident. Our offer won't be on the table indefinitely. Goodbye, Mr. Dawson, Jake said pointedly. The developer nodded, seemingly unfazed by the dismissal. I'll be in touch. He turned to leave, then paused. You know, I was a big fan back in your rodeo days, Foster. Watched you ride Devil's Dancer right before the accident. Shame about your leg and your career. With that parting shot, he returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Jake stood rigid, hands clenched at his sides, a muscle working in his jaw. How did he know about your financial concerns? Maria asked quietly when the SUV was out of sight. Jake shook his head. No idea. Maybe he was fishing, or maybe he's got someone at the bank feeding him information. He kicked at the dirt, frustration building. Doesn't matter. I'm not selling. Maria touched his arm gently. He wasn't wrong about the zoning changes, Jake. If they pass, this whole area could change dramatically and fast. Then we'll fight the zoning changes, Jake said firmly. I didn't come this far to give up now. He glanced at the horses, at Spirit watching him attentively from the fence line. I made them a promise. This is their home now. Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, then we need a plan. The town meeting is in 3 days. We should gather support, prepare statements. She pulled out her phone. I know some local environmental groups who would oppose the development. And there are ranchers who won't want their water rights threatened. Jake felt a wave of gratitude for her immediate support, her assumption that they were in this together. It had been a long time since he'd had someone in his corner. That night, after tending to the horses, Jake sat on his porch with one of the books Maria had brought him. But he couldn't focus on the words. Dawson's visit had left him unsettled, not just because of the threat to the sanctuary, but because of the man's parting comment about the accident. Jake rarely thought about that day anymore. At least he tried not to. But Dawson's words had brought it all rushing back. The roar of the crowd, the feeling of power beneath him as Devil's Dancer exploded from the chute. 8 seconds of perfect rhythm, man and beast moving as one. Then the sudden shift, the world tilting as he was thrown, the impact of the ground, and finally, the crushing weight of the bull on his leg. The doctors saying he'd never ride professionally again. A soft nickering pulled Jake from his dark memories. Spirit had approached the fence nearest the house, watching Jake with what seemed like concern. The Mustang's ears were forward, his posture relaxed but attentive. Jake set aside his book and limped over to the fence. Spirit didn't retreat, instead stretching his neck to sniff Jake's outstretched hand. "We're going to be okay, boy," Jake murmured, gently stroking the horse's nose. "They're not taking this place from us. I promise." Jake woke before dawn, his leg aching more than usual. The changing weather often affected his injury, and the desert air had turned cooler with the approach of fall. Wincing, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his brace. He'd grown accustomed to the morning ritual, securing the supportive device, massaging the stiff muscles, and forcing himself to stand despite the pain. As he made his way to the kitchen to start coffee, he glanced out the window toward the corrals. In the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the silhouettes of the horses, 3 of them clustered together near the water trough. But something wasn't right. Jake squinted, counting again. 3. There should be 4. Coffee forgotten, Jake grabbed his jacket and hurried outside as quickly as his leg would allow. As he approached the corral, his fear was confirmed. Rusty, Flash, and Oreo huddled together, but Spirit was nowhere to be seen. A section of fencing on the far side was down, rails broken and splintered, leaving a gap wide enough for a horse to pass through. "Spirit!" Jake called, his voice echoing across the empty desert landscape. No answering whinny came. His heart pounded as he examined the damaged fence. The break was deliberate, not caused by a horse kicking or pushing, but by human hands. Someone had cut the rails with a saw and removed them. Jake felt sick. Had Dawson resorted to sabotage after his offer was rejected? Or were there horse thieves in the area? Spirit was a magnificent animal, worth a good sum to the right buyer, especially now that he'd begun to accept human contact. Jake limped back to the house, grabbed his phone, and called Maria. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Spirit's gone," he said without preamble. "Someone cut the fence during the night." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she replied immediately, all traces of sleepiness gone. "Don't leave before I get there." While waiting, Jake examined the perimeter of his property. He found tire tracks not far from the broken fence, not from his truck or Maria's SUV, but something heavier with a wider tread pattern. He took photos with his phone, fighting the rising sense of helplessness. The desert was vast, and Spirit could be miles away by now, whether stolen or running free. When Maria arrived, she brought unexpected help. 2 men in a dust-covered pickup truck "This is Frank and Tony Rodriguez," Maria explained. "They've had problems with fence cutting too. They think it might be related to the development company trying to pressure landowners." Frank, the older of the 2 brothers, nodded grimly. "3 of our cattle went missing last month. Found the fence cut just like yours. We know this desert better than anyone," Tony added. "If your horse is out there, we'll find him." They organized quickly. The Rodriguez brothers would take their truck and head south, following the most likely path if Spirit had been stolen. Jake and Maria would go north on horseback, searching the areas Spirit might have headed if he was running free. Jake saddled Flash, whose racing background made him the best choice for a potentially long ride, while Maria rode her own horse, a steady bay mare she'd brought in her trailer. As they rode out, Maria explained that wild horses often followed predictable patterns, seeking water sources and familiar territory. If Spirit wasn't stolen, he'll head for water first, then probably try to find other horses. There's a band of wild mustangs that sometimes comes down from the northern hills this time of year. Jake nodded, though his thoughts were dark. Even if Spirit had escaped on his own, the desert was full of dangers: quicksand, predators, barbed wire fences, and steep ravines. A horse running in panic could easily injure himself fatally. The morning sun climbed higher, harsh and unforgiving. Jake's leg began to throb mercilessly as they rode, but he refused to slow their pace. They followed a dry creek bed that Maria said would eventually lead to a seasonal spring, checking for hoof prints in the sandy soil. There, Maria pointed to distinct hoof prints in a patch of damp sand. Those are fresh, and they're big. Could be Spirit. They followed the tracks for another mile until they reached a small spring surrounded by cottonwood trees, a rare oasis in the desert landscape. Spirit wasn't there, but the tracks continued northward, accompanied now by other hoof prints of various sizes. "He's found the wild herd," Maria said, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "That's good news and bad news. He'll be safer with them, but harder to catch." Jake felt a conflicting surge of emotions. Part of him was glad that Spirit had found freedom and companions of his own kind. Wasn't that what he promised the horse? A sanctuary where he could live as naturally as possible? But another part of him ached at the thought of losing the animal he'd grown so attached to. "We should keep going," he said, adjusting his position in the saddle to ease the pressure on his aching leg, just to make sure he's okay. Maria studied him with knowing eyes. "You don't have to pretend you're just checking on him, Jake. It's okay to want him back." Jake didn't respond, nudging Flash forward to follow the tracks. The hoof prints led them higher into the foothills, through increasingly rugged terrain. By midday, they had to dismount and lead their horses along a narrow, rocky path that followed the contour of a steep hillside. "The spring is up ahead," Maria said, pointing to a patch of green vegetation in the distance. "Wild horses come here when the lower water sources dry up." As they rounded a bend in the trail, Jake suddenly held up his hand, signaling Maria to stop. About a quarter-mile ahead, in a small grassy valley, was a band of wild horses, perhaps 15 animals of various colors, grazing peacefully beside a spring-fed pool. And among them, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, was Spirit. The Mustang seemed uninjured, moving easily among the wild horses. Jake watched as Spirit approached the stallion, who appeared to be the herd leader, a dappled gray with a flowing mane. The two horses sniffed each other, then engaged in a brief display of dominance, rearing and whistling. Spirit backed down quickly, seemingly content to accept a subordinate position in the herd hierarchy. "He looks happy," Jake said softly, surprised by the sudden tightness in his throat. "He does," Maria agreed, "but let's get closer. I want to check something." They carefully secured their mounts to a stunted juniper tree and continued on foot, moving slowly to avoid startling the wild herd. As they crept closer, using the terrain for cover, Jake began to notice something disturbing. Several of the horses appeared thin, their ribs visible beneath their hides. One mare was limping badly, and another had what looked like rope burns on her neck. "Those horses have been through hell," Maria whispered, her expression grim. "Poachers, most likely. They've been chased, maybe even captured and escaped." Jake felt a surge of anger. The same people who had tried to capture Spirit were still operating in the area, terrorizing the wild herds. "We need to call someone," he said. "The BLM, or whatever agency handles wild horses." "I will," Maria replied. "But first, we need to decide about Spirit." Jake watched the black Mustang, now drinking from the spring alongside a young filly. Spirit looked up suddenly, his nostrils flaring as he caught their scent on the breeze. His ears pricked forward, and he stared directly at their hiding place. "He knows we're here," Jake said. "What do we do now?" Maria considered for a moment. "Show yourself to him. Let him decide." Taking a deep breath, Jake stood slowly from their concealed position. The wild horses immediately noticed him, several raising their heads in alarm. The lead stallion snorted and pawed the ground, while several mares began herding their foals away from the perceived threat. But Spirit remained where he was, staring at Jake with unmistakable recognition. "Hey, boy," Jake called softly, not moving closer. "It's okay." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The wild horses began to drift away from the spring, sensing danger. The lead stallion trumpeted a warning call, urging his herd to follow him toward the safety of higher ground. All the horses responded to his signal, all except Spirit, who remained frozen in place, caught between his wild nature and his connection to Jake. Jake slowly lowered himself to a seated position on the ground, deliberately making himself smaller, less threatening. He didn't call out again, didn't try to approach. This had to be Spirit's choice. The wild herd disappeared over a ridge, leaving Spirit alone by the spring. The Mustang took a few hesitant steps toward Jake, then stopped, nostrils flaring as he assessed the situation. "He's deciding," Maria whispered from her hiding place. "Don't move." Jake remained perfectly still, ignoring the painful protest from his leg. Spirit took another few steps forward, then stopped again. The horse looked back toward where the herd had disappeared, then again at Jake. Freedom or sanctuary? Wild instinct or human connection? The choice was his. With a soft whinny that seemed to carry all the complexity of his conflict, Spirit suddenly broke into a trot, heading directly toward Jake. Jake's heart pounded as the Mustang approached. When Spirit was just a few feet away, he stopped, stretching his neck forward to sniff Jake's outstretched hand. Then, with a gentleness that belied his wild nature, the horse nudged Jake's shoulder, as if greeting an old friend. "Hey there," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Missed you too." Maria emerged from her hiding place, approaching slowly. "I've never seen anything like that," she said, wonder in her voice. "He really chose you over the wild herd." Jake carefully stood, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. Spirit stayed beside him, occasionally glancing back toward where the wild horses had disappeared, but making no move to follow them. "Now comes the tricky part," Jake said, getting him back to the sanctuary. They had no halter or lead rope for Spirit, nothing to secure him for the journey home. He would have to follow them willingly or not at all. "Let's try something," Maria suggested. She untied the bandana from around her neck and handed it to Jake. "Your scent is on you. Rub this against your neck, then tie it loosely around Spirit's. It might help him feel connected to you during the journey." Jake did as she suggested. Spirit tensed initially when Jake raised the bandana toward his neck, but allowed it to be tied without protest. The Mustang seemed to understand that they wanted him to come with them, following willingly as they made their way back to where Flash and Maria's mare were waiting. The real test came when they mounted their horses. Would Spirit follow them back to the sanctuary? Or would he change his mind and return to the wild herd? To Jake's relief, Spirit followed without hesitation, seeming almost eager to travel with them. They kept their pace moderate, aware that Spirit was choosing to remain with them with each step. The journey back was slower than their outward trip, but Jake hardly noticed the passing time or the pain in his leg. His focus remained on Spirit, watching for signs of distress or hesitation. About halfway back to the sanctuary, they spotted a dust cloud approaching from the south. The Rodriguez brothers' truck bouncing over the rough terrain toward them. "Looks like they got our message," Maria said. They had sent a text earlier, once they'd found cell service, letting the brothers know that Spirit had been located. The truck pulled up beside them, and Tony leaned out the window. "Found your horse, I see, and he looks happy to be back with you." Jake nodded, but his expression was serious. "We found a wild herd up by the northern spring. Look like they've been chased by poachers. Same ones who had Spirit, probably. Several are injured." Frank's face darkened. "Those bastards are at it again. They come through every few months, rounding up as many as they can for the slaughterhouses down in Mexico." "We need to report them," Maria said firmly. "Already have, many times," Tony replied, with a shrug. "But the BLM is understaffed, and the sheriff's department doesn't consider it a priority. By the time anyone investigates, the poachers are long gone." Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. The sanctuary wasn't just about giving retired and abused domestic horses a place to live out their days in peace. It could be a safe haven for wild horses too, those at risk from poachers and other threats. "We should take a look at that damaged fence when we get back," Frank suggested. "Might be able to tell if it was cut by poachers or Dawson's people." The mention of Dawson's name reminded Jake of the town meeting scheduled for the next day, the zoning changes that threatened to transform the entire valley. The events of the day had pushed it from his mind, but now the looming confrontation returned to his thoughts. As they neared the sanctuary, Jake was relieved to see that nothing else had been disturbed during their absence. The other horses nickered in greeting as they approached, clearly excited by Spirit's return. The black Mustang trotted ahead eagerly to reunite with his companions, especially Rusty, who had become something of a father figure to the younger horse. "He's home," Maria said softly, watching the reunion. By choice, Frank and Tony examined the broken fence, conferring quietly before sharing their assessment. "This wasn't poachers," Frank said definitively. "They would have just taken the horse, not released him. This was done to cause problems for you." "Dawson?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Tony nodded. "It has his signature. He's done this before. Pressure tactics to make property owners feel vulnerable, unsafe, make them want to sell and get out. We've had cattle fences cut, water lines damaged," Frank added. "All started after we refused to sell to Sunrise Development." Jake felt a surge of anger, but also determination. "Then we need to be at that town meeting tomorrow. All of us. Show the commissioners that we're not backing down." The brothers helped repair the damaged fence, reinforcing it to make future tampering more difficult. They promised to spread the word about the meeting to other ranchers and landowners who might be affected by the proposed changes. By the time they left, Jake had gained not just temporary assistance, but what felt like genuine allies. "You've got friends here now," Maria observed as they watched the brothers' truck disappear down the dusty road. "That's worth more than gold in these parts." Jake nodded, surprised by how quickly his isolation had transformed into community. A month ago, he'd come to the desert seeking solitude, a place to lick his wounds and start over without the complications of human connections. Now he found himself at the center of a growing network of neighbors, united by common purpose. That evening, after tending to the horses and securing all gates and fences, Jake sat on his porch, watching Spirit graze peacefully with the other horses. Maria joined him, bringing 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You should get some rest," she said, handing him a mug. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully. His leg was throbbing after the long ride, and exhaustion pulled at his muscles. But his mind was too active for sleep, filled with the images of the day. Spirit with the wild herd, the moment of choice, the injured horses that needed protection. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about expanding the sanctuary's purpose." Maria raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Not just retired and abused domestic horses, but wild ones too. The ones at risk from poachers or loss of habitat." He gestured toward the vast desert landscape beyond his property. "There's enough land here. With some additional water sources and proper fencing, we could provide a safe haven for more wild horses." Maria considered this thoughtfully. "That would be a big undertaking. More costs, more paperwork with government agencies. You'd probably need that non-profit status after all." "I know," Jake admitted. "But after today, seeing those horses, what they've been through, I can't just ignore it. And with developers like Dawson pushing for more land, the wild herds will have fewer safe places," Maria added. "It's a good idea, Jake. A necessary one, even. But it would mean fully committing to this life, this place." Jake watched as Spirit approached the fence nearest the house, the red bandana still loosely tied around his neck. The Mustang stood quietly, regarding them with intelligent eyes that seemed to contain the wildness of the desert itself. "I think I already have," Jake said simply. As darkness descended over the sanctuary, Jake felt a profound sense of purpose settling over him like a mantle. Tomorrow, they would face Dawson and the county commissioners, fighting for not just his land, but a vision of what this place could become. A true sanctuary for horses, both wild and domestic. A place of healing and freedom. The county courthouse was a squat, imposing building of red sandstone that dominated the small town of Copper Creek. By the time Jake and Maria arrived, the parking lot was already filled with vehicles. Not just the sedans and SUVs of town dwellers, but the mud-spattered trucks and jeeps of ranchers and farmers from the surrounding areas. "Looks like a good turnout," Maria observed as they found a spot for Jake's truck. "The Rodriguez brothers must have spread the word." Jake nodded, feeling a flutter of anxiety. He hadn't been around this many people since his accident, since his very public fall from grace. For a moment, he considered turning back, letting Maria and the others fight this battle without him. But then he thought of Spirit, of the sanctuary, of what would be lost if Dawson and his developers got their way. "Let's do this," he said, climbing out of the truck and adjusting his brace. His leg was still stiff from the previous day's ride, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the task ahead. Inside, the courthouse meeting room was packed. The air was stifling with the press of bodies and the tension of competing interests. At the front of the room, behind a raised table, sat the 5 county commissioners, 3 men and 2 women, all with the weathered faces of longtime desert residents, but dressed in the formal attire of their office. Jake recognized Richard Dawson immediately, standing near the commissioner's table in an impeccable suit that looked as out of place here as it had at the sanctuary. The developer was surrounded by a small entourage of similarly well-dressed individuals, clutching folders and tablets. Lawyers and consultants, Jake guessed. Maria spotted the Rodriguez brothers and waved. They had saved seats for Jake and Maria toward the front of the room, a gesture that touched Jake unexpectedly. He followed Maria through the crowd, aware of curious glances and whispered comments as people recognized him. The former rodeo star, now a reclusive horse sanctuary owner. "Good crowd," Frank Rodriguez said as they sat down. Word got around fast. Nobody likes the idea of outsiders coming in and changing zoning laws to suit themselves. Before Jake could respond, the meeting was called to order by the chair of the commission, a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. This public hearing on proposed Ordinance 277 regarding changes to rural zoning designations is now in session, she announced, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. We'll begin with a presentation from the applicant, Sunrise Development Corporation. Richard Dawson stepped forward, his confidence evident in every smooth movement. He adjusted the microphone and smiled at the commissioners and the crowd with practiced charm. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the commission. I'm Richard Dawson, Senior Development Director for Sunrise Development Corporation. We're excited to present our vision for Copper Valley Resort and Residences, a world-class ecotourism destination that will bring sustainable economic growth to Copper County. With a nod to one of his assistants, a large screen lit up behind him, displaying a sophisticated digital rendering of what looked like a luxury resort complex nestled against the mountains. The image showed verdant golf courses, swimming pools, and elegant buildings designed to blend with the desert landscape. Our proposed development will create over 300 permanent jobs, with an additional 500 during the construction phase, Dawson continued, his voice rising with enthusiasm. It will generate an estimated $12 million in annual tax revenue for Copper County, revitalizing your struggling economy and providing funds for schools, infrastructure, and public services. The presentation continued, with Dawson and his team highlighting the economic benefits, environmental considerations, and minimal impact on existing landowners. They showed more sleek renderings and graphs depicting job growth and property value increases. It was polished, professional, and persuasive. The proposed zoning changes are necessary to move forward with this transformative project, Dawson concluded. We respectfully ask the Commission to approve Ordinance 277 and help bring Copper County into a prosperous new era. Several of the commissioners were nodding, clearly impressed by the slick presentation. The chair thanked Dawson, then announced, "We'll now hear from members of the public. Please keep your comments to 3 minutes." For the next hour, a parade of speakers took the microphone. Most were local business owners expressing support for the development, citing the need for economic growth and tourism dollars. A few were concerned citizens raising questions about water usage or traffic increases, but none outright opposed the project. Jake felt his anxiety rising. The tide seemed to be flowing in Dawson's favor. He wasn't prepared to speak publicly. He'd never been good with words, especially in front of crowds. But as the meeting progressed, he found himself growing increasingly restless, the need to defend his sanctuary building within him. Finally, Frank Rodriguez was called to speak. The rancher approached the microphone with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "My family has ranched in Copper Valley for 4 generations," he began without preamble. "We've weathered droughts, economic downturns, and changes in the cattle industry. But the biggest threat we face now is water. These developers talk about minimal environmental impact, but let me tell you what's not in their glossy presentation. Golf courses in the desert require massive amounts of water. Water that comes from the same aquifer that sustains our ranches, our wildlife, and our way of life. He turned to face Dawson directly. And they don't talk about their tactics. Since refusing to sell our land, my brother and I have had fences cut, cattle lost, and water lines damaged. Just yesterday, a neighbor had his horse sanctuary vandalized. Fences deliberately cut to release valuable animals. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dawson's face flushed with anger, and he leaned to whisper something to one of his lawyers. The chair gavelled for order. Mr. Rodriguez, those are serious accusations. Do you have evidence of these claims? We have police reports, photographs, and multiple witnesses, Frank replied calmly. And we're not the only ones. Ask around. Anyone who's refused to sell to Sunrise has experienced similar problems. When it was Maria's turn to speak, she approached the microphone with the authority of her credentials. I'm Dr. Maria Reyes, wildlife biologist specializing in desert ecosystems. I've spent 5 years studying the unique environment of Copper Valley, and I can tell you with scientific certainty that the proposed development would be devastating to local wildlife, including protected species like the desert tortoise and the wild horse bands that are part of our regional heritage. She continued with a precise but passionate explanation of the ecological impacts, supporting her arguments with data and research. Jake was impressed by her eloquence and knowledge, but he could see that some of the commissioners were beginning to look bored, their eyes glazing over at the scientific terminology. When she finished, the chair called the next name on the list, Jake Foster. Jake felt his mouth go dry. He hadn't signed up to speak. Looking over at Frank, he saw the rancher give him a small nod of encouragement. Maria squeezed his arm as he stood, whispering, "Just speak from the heart." With a deep breath, Jake made his way to the microphone, acutely aware of his limp, of the eyes following him. He reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some indifferent, some openly hostile. "My name is Jake Foster," he began, his voice rough from disuse. "Some of you might know me from my rodeo days. Now I run a horse sanctuary on Sunny Valley Ranch, about 30 miles west of here." He paused, gathering his thoughts. There was no carefully prepared speech, no data or economic projections to share, just the truth as he knew it. "I came to Copper Valley looking for a fresh start after my accident. What I found was more than just a place to live. I found a purpose. My sanctuary takes in horses that have nowhere else to go, retired rodeo and race horses, abandoned farm animals, and even wild mustangs that have been targeted by poachers." Jake glanced at Dawson, who was watching him with a calculated expression. "Yesterday, someone cut the fences on my property and released a wild mustang I'd been rehabilitating. It wasn't random vandalism. It was meant to scare me, to make me give up and sell out." He looked directly at the commissioners. "I'm not here to talk about economic impact studies or property values. I'm here to talk about what's at stake. Copper Valley isn't just real estate to be bought and sold. It's home to people, to wildlife, to horses that deserve a second chance." Jake felt his confidence growing as he spoke, the words coming more easily now. "That Mustang that was released? His name is Spirit. He was caught by poachers, injured and traumatized. Yesterday, when he found himself free, he had a choice: return to a wild herd we found in the hills, or come back to the sanctuary with me. He chose to come back because he'd found something worth returning to: safety, care, respect." Jake leaned slightly on the podium, taking weight off his aching leg. "That's what we're doing here today. Making a choice about what kind of place Copper Valley will be. A resort playground for the wealthy, or a sanctuary for a way of life that's worth preserving. He took a deep breath. I ask you to vote against these zoning changes, not just for my sake or for the animals I care for, but for everything and everyone that makes this valley special. Thank you. As Jake returned to his seat, he was surprised by the scattered applause that followed him. Maria was beaming, and Frank clapped him firmly on the shoulder. "Well said, neighbor," the rancher murmured. "Didn't know you had that in you." Jake hadn't known either. The words had come from somewhere deep inside, from the part of him that had been awakened by his connection with spirit and the sanctuary. Richard Dawson was the last to speak, taking the opportunity for rebuttal. His polished demeanor had slipped slightly, revealing an edge of frustration and determination. While we respect the concerns expressed today, the reality is that Copper County's economy is stagnant. The mining industry is dying, tourism is sporadic at best, and young people are leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Our development offers a solution: sustainable growth, environmental stewardship, and economic prosperity. His voice hardened. As for the accusations of vandalism and intimidation, Sunrise Development categorically denies any involvement. These are serious, unfounded allegations that border on slander. Perhaps some of these incidents are simply the result of living in a remote area with minimal law enforcement presence. He straightened his tie, regaining his composure. I urge the Commission to look at the facts, the economic projections, and the benefits this development will bring to the entire county. The future of Copper County depends on your decision. Thank you. The commissioners conferred quietly among themselves before the chair announced that they would deliberate on the matter and hold a vote at their next scheduled meeting in 2 weeks. We appreciate everyone's input today and will consider all perspectives before making our decision. As the meeting adjourned, Jake felt drained, but oddly satisfied. He had stood up for what he believed in, had made his voice heard. Whether it would make a difference remained to be seen. But at least he'd tried. People approached him as the crowd dispersed. Ranchers, small business owners, ordinary citizens who introduced themselves and thanked him for speaking. Some shared their own stories of pressure from Sunrise Development, of mysterious property damage, or suddenly rescinded bank loans. Jake was surprised by how many had experienced similar tactics. Through it all, he noticed Richard Dawson watching him from across the room, the developer's expression unreadable but intense. Finally, as Jake and Maria were preparing to leave, Dawson approached them, his entourage a few steps behind. "Mr. Foster," he said, extending his hand. "An impassioned speech. I appreciate your dedication to your project." Jake didn't take the offered hand. "It's not a project, Mr. Dawson. It's my life's work." Dawson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Still, passion aside, I think we both know which way the Commission is leaning. The economic arguments are simply too compelling." "We'll see about that," Maria interjected. "Not everyone can be bought." The developer's expression hardened momentarily before he regained his professional demeanor. "Before you continue this resistance, I want to make one last offer." He lowered his voice, stepping closer to Jake. "Double your property's market value, plus relocation assistance to a new facility with better accessibility for your horses. My company would even provide a grant to help establish your sanctuary in a more suitable location." Everyone wins. Jake was momentarily taken aback by the generous offer. It was substantially more than what Dawson had implied before, and for a brief moment, he found himself considering it. A purpose-built facility would make caring for the horses easier, especially with his leg. He could accomplish more, help more animals, but then he thought of spirit. of the mustang's choice to return to the land he'd come to know as home, of the wild herd in the foothills, vulnerable to poachers and habitat loss. "No," Jake said, the word coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. "My sanctuary stays where it is." Dawson's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Foster. This isn't just about your little horse haven. This is about the future of the entire county." "Then let the county decide," Jake replied evenly. "At the next meeting. Just remember," Dawson said, his voice dropping to a new whisper, "when the zoning changes pass, and they will, property values in the affected areas will plummet. Water costs will rise. You'll find yourself surrounded by construction, your peace and quiet gone. And when you finally decide to sell, my offer won't be nearly as generous." He straightened, adjusting his tie. "Think about it. You have 2 weeks." With that, Dawson turned and left, his entourage following in his wake. "Charming guy," Maria commented dryly. "I think you rattled him with your speech. He wasn't expecting that from the quiet horse guy." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He's right about one thing. The commission is probably leaning his way. The economic arguments are strong." "Then we need to make stronger ones," came a new voice. Jake turned to see a woman approaching them, one of the commissioners, the youngest of the 5, with short brown hair and determined eyes. She introduced herself as Elena Vasquez, representing the Eastern District of the county. "I was impressed by your testimony, Mr. Foster," she said, "and I'm concerned about these allegations of intimidation tactics. But you're right. Many of my colleagues are swayed by the promise of jobs and tax revenue." "What can we do?" Maria asked. Commissioner Vasquez glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "If you could provide solid evidence of these intimidation tactics, that would help. But more importantly, you need to show that there are viable alternatives for economic development that don't involve selling out to Sunrise." "Like what?" Jake asked, intrigued. "Ecotourism focused on the natural beauty and wildlife, agricultural initiatives, renewable energy. Sunrise isn't the only path to prosperity." She handed Maria her business card. "I can't be seen as taking sides publicly, but if you can put together a coalition and develop an alternative vision for the county, I'll make sure it gets a fair hearing." After the commissioner left, Frank and Tony Rodriguez joined them. "Made some new friends, I see," Frank observed. Jake briefly shared what Commissioner Vasquez had suggested. The brothers exchanged looks. Then Tony said, "We might have something that could help. Come by our place tomorrow if you can. We've been collecting evidence of Sunrise's tactics for months. Might be time to put it all together." As they left the courthouse, Jake felt both exhausted and energized. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone in it. The sanctuary had given him purpose. But this struggle was giving him something he hadn't realized he was missing: community. That night, back at the ranch, Jake sat on his porch, watching Spirit and the other horses in the moonlight. The Mustang seemed more settled than ever, grazing peacefully alongside his companions, occasionally raising his head to check on Jake's presence. "We've got a fight ahead of us, boy," Jake murmured. "But I think we've got a chance." Spirit nickered softly in response, as if understanding every word. Jake woke to the acrid smell of smoke. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, back at the rodeo, with the scent of cigarettes and concession stands in the air. Then his eyes snapped open, his senses suddenly alert. This wasn't the harmless smoke of memory. This was the real thing. He stumbled out of bed and hurried to the window. The pre-dawn sky glowed an unnatural orange to the northwest, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. A wildfire, Not uncommon in Arizona this time of year, especially after the rains had encouraged growth that was now tinder dry under the relentless sun. Jake grabbed his phone. 3 missed calls from Maria and a text message. Fire in the national forest. Moving fast. Get ready to evacuate the horses. His heart hammering, Jake called her back as he pulled on his clothes and boots. She answered immediately, her voice tense but controlled. "How bad is it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Bad. Started late last night. Dry lightning strike. The wind's pushing it east, toward your place and mine. They've got fire crews out, but it's moving fast. What should I do? I've got 4 horses." Jake's mind raced, trying to prioritize. He'd never had to evacuate animals before. "Start prepping them now. Get halters and lead ropes ready for all of them. I've got a trailer that can take 2 at a time. Rodriguez brothers are organizing other trailers. We'll get them out." Jake. Her calm competence steadied him. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. By the time Jake made it out to the corrals, the smell of smoke was stronger, and ash particles drifted in the air like dirty snow. The horses were agitated, pacing their enclosures, nostrils flared as they sensed the approaching danger. Spirit was particularly restless, his eyes wild, ears pricked toward the orange glow on the horizon. Jake talked to them in a soothing voice as he gathered halters and lead ropes, buckets of grain to entice them into trailers, and water for the journey. He didn't know where they'd be taking the horses, but it would likely be a long drive, away from the path of the fire. The sound of approaching vehicles made him look up. Maria's SUV and trailer bounced up the driveway, followed by 2 more pickup trucks with trailers. The Rodriguez brothers and another rancher Jake didn't recognize. "We don't have much time," Maria said as she jumped out of her vehicle. Fires jumped the containment line. They're evacuating everyone in the valley. The newcomer, a weather-beaten man with kind eyes, introduced himself as Hank Simmons. "Got a ranch about 20 miles east, out of the fire's path. You can bring your horses there." They worked quickly, efficiently. Frank and Tony took Rusty and Flash in their trailer. Hank loaded Oreo, the small pony, into his. That left Spirit for Maria's trailer. Jake had expected the Mustang to be the most difficult, given his wild origins and natural fear. But to his surprise, Spirit loaded calmly, responding to Jake's gentle guidance. "He trusts you," Maria observed as they secured the trailer door. "Let's get moving. Take what you need from the house." Quickly, Jake rushed into the house, his mind whirling. What did he need to save? His rodeo trophies? Photos? Important documents? In the end, he grabbed his laptop, a fireproof box containing his deed and insurance papers, a change of clothes, and a framed photo of himself with his father at his first rodeo competition. Everything else, he realized, was replaceable. As he headed back outside, he paused to look around the small ranch house he'd worked so hard to make habitable. Would it still be standing when he returned? The thought of losing it all, the sanctuary, the progress he'd made with Spirit, the new purpose he'd found, hit him like a physical blow. But there was no time for sentiment. The sky was darker now, the smell of smoke stronger. Maria was waiting by her SUV, her expression tight with worry. "The road west is already closed," she said as he approached. "We'll have to go south, then loop around east to get to Hank's place." Jake nodded, tossing his belongings into her vehicle. He took one last look at the sanctuary, the corrals he'd repaired, the barn he'd cleaned out, the pastures he'd reclaimed from the desert. Then he climbed into the passenger seat of Maria's SUV, his injured leg protesting the rush of movement. As they pulled away, trailer swaying behind them, Jake could see the orange glow of the fire reflected in the rearview mirror, growing larger and brighter with each passing minute. The Rodriguez brothers and Hank were ahead of them, their trucks and trailers raising dust clouds on the unpaved road. "How did it spread so fast?" Jake asked, watching the smoke plume rise and expand in the mirror. Maria's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "The Forest Service says it's unusual behavior, even for our dry conditions. The fire's creating its own weather system, jumping containment lines. They've called in crews from 3 counties." They drove in tense silence for several miles, the road rough beneath them. Spirit occasionally stamped or snorted in the trailer, but overall remained calm. Jake kept checking over his shoulder, watching the growing cloud of smoke and ash that seemed to be gaining on them. Suddenly, Maria slammed on the brakes. Ahead, where the dirt road met the paved highway, a sheriff's deputy was directing traffic. He approached their vehicle, his face grim beneath his hat. "Roads closed," he announced. "Fires jumped the highway up ahead. You'll need to head north on County Road 22. Follow the evacuation route." Maria nodded, turning the wheels sharply. "The others?" she asked, indicating the trailers ahead. "Already redirected them," the deputy confirmed. "Move quickly. This area is going to be under mandatory evacuation within the hour." They turned north onto a narrow county road that Jake didn't recognize. The terrain here was more rugged, with steep hills and deep arroyos on either side. The trailers swayed precariously as Maria navigated the uneven surface. "This isn't good," she muttered, eyes fixed on the road. "This route will take us too close to the fire line." Jake checked his phone for updates, but there was no service. They were on their own, with only the deputy's directions to guide them. In the side mirror, he could see the smoke drawing closer, now tinged with the orange glow of active flames cresting a distant ridge. They crested a hill, and suddenly the full scope of the fire was visible. It wasn't just behind them anymore. It had split, creating a second front that was burning along the ridge to their right, moving parallel to their route. "Jesus," Jake breathed, watching as flames leapt from tree to tree, consuming the dry pine forest with terrifying speed. Maria accelerated, pushing the SUV and trailer to their limits on the rough road. "We need to get through before it crosses our path." The air grew hotter, thicker with smoke that stung their eyes and scratched at their throats. In the trailer, Spirit began to panic, kicking at the sides and whinnying in fear. The sound tore at Jake's heart, but there was nothing he could do to comfort the horse while they were fleeing for their lives. "There's the others," Maria said, pointing ahead to where 3 vehicles were pulled off to the side of the road. As they drew closer, Jake could see the Rodriguez brothers standing beside their truck. Gesturing urgently, Maria pulled up beside them, rolling down her window. "What's wrong?" "Bridge is out," Frank shouted over the sound of frightened horses and the distant roar of the fire. "Flash flood damage from last month. There's no way across the canyon." Jake felt a chill, despite the surrounding heat. They were trapped between the advancing fire and an impassable canyon. He scanned the area, looking for options. The road they were on dead-ended at the damaged bridge. To the right, the fire was consuming the forest, advancing toward them with unnerving speed. To the left was a steep drop into the canyon. Behind them, the way they'd come was rapidly being cut off by the main fire front. "Is there another way around?" Jake asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Hank, who had been studying a paper map spread across his truck hood, looked up. "There's an old Forest Service road about half a mile back. Might be our only shot." "Will it get us out of the fire's path?" Maria asked. "Hard to say. It heads east through the canyon. Should eventually connect with Highway 40. If the fire hasn't jumped that far yet." It was a gamble, but they had no choice. Quickly, They turned their vehicles around, Hank leading the way. Jake could see the strain on Maria's face as she maneuvered the SUV and trailer on the narrow road, trying to balance speed with safety. They found the Forest Service Road, little more than a dirt track, disappearing into the dense underbrush. It didn't look like it had been maintained in years, with washouts and overgrown sections clearly visible. "I don't know if the trailers can make it through that," Frank said dubiously, eyeing the rutted path. "We might have to let the horses go," Tony suggested. "At least they'd have a chance to outrun the fire." Jake stared at the younger Rodriguez brother in horror. "We can't just release them. They'd panic, run right into the flames." Maria's voice cut through the argument. "We're taking the horses, one trailer at a time. The lead vehicle breaks the trail. The others follow exactly in the same tracks." Her tone left no room for debate. Hank nodded. "I'll go first. My rig's the lightest with just the pony." As Hank's truck disappeared down the overgrown track, Jake could hear the distant sound of emergency sirens, far behind them. The fire was advancing faster than even the authorities had anticipated. The Rodriguez brothers followed next, their larger trailer scraping against tree branches and bouncing dangerously over ruts in the road. Jake and Maria brought up the rear, the progress agonizingly slow. Through the trees, Jake could see embers drifting like malevolent fireflies, the harbingers of the approaching inferno. "The fire's spotting ahead of the main front," Maria said grimly, noticing his gaze. "Those embers can start new fires miles ahead." As if to confirm her words, a small pine tree to their right suddenly burst into flames as a wind-borne ember found purchase in its dry needles. Maria swerved to avoid it, the trailer tilting precariously on the uneven ground. "We're not going to make it," Jake murmured, watching as more spot fires ignited around them. The Forest Service Road was becoming as dangerous as the route they'd abandoned. "There," Maria pointed ahead. "The canyon opens up. See that clearing by the river?" Jake squinted through the smoke. About a quarter mile ahead, the forest thinned, revealing a wide, sandy area beside a shallow river. The Rodriguez brothers' trailer was already pulling into the clearing, followed by Hank. "If we can get down there, the water will provide some protection," Maria continued, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated the final stretch of treacherous road. They reached the clearing just as the fire crested the ridge behind them, a wall of flame that seemed to devour the world. Heat pressed against them like a physical force, and the roar of the fire drowned out even the panicked sounds of the horses. "Get the animals out!" Frank shouted as they pulled up. "Into the water!" Jake limped to the back of the trailer, fighting against his screaming leg to reach Spirit. The Mustang was in a full panic now, eyes rolling, coat dark with sweat. As Jake opened the trailer door, the horse nearly knocked him over in his rush to escape, only the lead rope keeping him from bolting. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "I've got you." All around them, chaos reigned. The Rodriguez brothers were struggling with Flash, the ex-racehorse fighting their attempts to lead him toward the water. Rusty, ever steady, stood trembling but obedient. Hank had already gotten Oreo into the shallow part of the river, the pony standing belly deep in the water, ears pinned back in fear. Maria appeared at Jake's side, taking the lead rope. "I'll help you with Spirit. The water's our only chance." Together, they urged Spirit toward the river, the Mustang balking at first at the unfamiliar footing. The fire was advancing rapidly now, consuming the dry vegetation at the edge of the clearing. The air was thick with smoke and ash, making it difficult to breathe or see. Jake's eyes streamed tears, his lungs burning with every breath. Spirit finally stepped into the water, flinching at the sensation, before allowing himself to be led deeper. Jake and Maria stayed with him. The cool water, a shocking contrast to the intense heat bearing down on them. The other horses were already in position, their owners standing beside them, faces grim with determination. "Get down low," Frank called over the roar of the approaching fire. "Use your shirts to cover your faces. Breathe through the wet cloth." Jake removed his shirt, soaking it in the river before wrapping it around his lower face. Maria did the same. They huddled together beside Spirit, the water up to their waists, watching as the fire reached the edge of the clearing. It was like standing at the gates of hell. Trees exploded in flames, the heat so intense that Jake could feel it, searing his exposed skin, despite the water surrounding him. Spirit trembled violently, muscles tense beneath Jake's steadying hand. "It's okay," Jake whispered, though he knew the horse couldn't hear him over the inferno's roar. "We're going to make it." The fire tore through the vegetation at the edge of the clearing, creating a wall of flame that seemed to stretch to the sky. Embers rained down, hissing as they hit the water's surface. Jake and Maria ducked lower, using their bodies to shield Spirit's head from the falling debris. And then Jake heard it, the distinctive thump-thump of helicopter rotors. Through a break in the smoke, he glimpsed a yellow firefighting helicopter, its water bucket dangling beneath like a pendulum. It hovered over the river upstream, filling its bucket before rising and disappearing into the smoke again. "They know we're here," Maria said, her voice barely audible through her makeshift mask and the fire's roar. "They're trying to protect this spot." Minutes later, water rained down near the edge of the clearing, a precise drop that created a temporary barrier between the humans and horses and the advancing flames. Another helicopter joined the first, the two aircraft working in tandem to protect the small island of refuge. For what seemed like hours, they stood in the river, the horses surprisingly steady now that they understood the water was safety. The helicopters continued their water drops, focusing on keeping the clearing defensible as the main fire front passed around them, driven by its own momentum and the shifting winds. Gradually, the hellish red glow began to fade, the roar diminishing to a distant crackle. The fire had moved on, leaving behind a blackened, smoking landscape. The air was still thick with smoke, but it was becoming possible to breathe without feeling like each inhalation was burning their lungs. "I think the worst has passed," Frank called from where he stood with Flash and Rusty. Fires moved east. They led the horses out of the water, all of them shaking with exhaustion and cold, despite the still intense heat radiating from the charred landscape. The vehicles and trailers, parked on the sandy area away from the trees, had survived, though they were covered in ash and some of the plastic trim had melted from the heat. One of the helicopters circled back, hovering low over the clearing. The pilot gave them a thumbs-up signal before pointing eastward, indicating, Jake assumed, that there was a safe path out in that direction. "We should go," Hank said, checking his trailer for damage. "Fire could shift again if the wind changes." Jake nodded, patting Spirit's neck. The Mustang was calmer now, his eyes no longer showing the whites of panic. Something had changed between them during those terrifying moments in the river. Jake had expected to be the one protecting Spirit, but in the end, they had steadied each other, a partnership forged in fire. As they prepared to load the horses back into the trailers, Jake's phone suddenly chimed with a notification. Cell service had returned. He glanced at the screen to see multiple missed calls and messages, including several from an unknown number. The most recent message from Maria, sent before they'd met up earlier, made his blood run cold. "Just heard from Commissioner Vasquez. Fire started near your property line. Arson suspected. Dawson seen an area yesterday. Be careful. A week after the fire, Jake stood at the edge of his property, surveying the damage. The western portion of his land was a blackened wasteland. The trees reduced to charred skeletons, the ground a moonscape of ash and debris. But the firefighters had managed to save the house, the barn, and most of the corrals. A small miracle considering the ferocity of the blaze. The horses had remained at Hank Simmons' ranch during the cleanup, safe and well cared for. Today, they would be coming home. "You're lucky," said Sheriff Morales, who had come out to document the suspected arson. "If the wind had been blowing from the west instead of the northwest, you'd have lost everything." Jake nodded, watching as the sheriff's deputy took photographs of what appeared to be the fire's origin point, a deliberate pile of accelerant-soaked debris just beyond Jake's fence line. The investigation was ongoing, but preliminary findings pointed to arson. No one had openly accused Dawson or Sunrise Development, but the timing was suspicious, to say the least. "Any leads?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Sheriff Morales shook his head. "Nothing concrete. We found tire tracks on the access road, but they're too degraded to identify. And the accelerant was just regular gasoline, available at any gas station." He pocketed his notebook. "We'll keep looking, but honestly, cases like this are hard to prove without witnesses." After the sheriff left, Jake continued assessing the damage, making mental notes of repairs needed. The fire had destroyed about a third of his fencing, damaged one of the smaller outbuildings, and rendered several acres temporarily unusable. His insurance would cover some of it, but not all. More expenses, more demands on his dwindling savings. The sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention. Maria's SUV led a small caravan. Her trailer, the Rodriguez brothers, truck and trailer, and several other vehicles Jake didn't recognize. As they pulled up to the house, he was surprised to see a news van among them, with Copper County News emblazoned on its side. "What's all this?" he asked, as Maria stepped out of her vehicle. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "Reinforcements and a bit of publicity." People began piling out of the vehicles. The Rodriguez brothers, Hank Simmons, Commissioner Elena Vasquez, and at least a dozen others Jake recognized from the town meeting. Some carried tools, others unloaded lumber and fencing materials from pickups. A reporter and cameraman from the local news station approached, the young woman holding a microphone with practiced professionalism. "Mr. Foster, I'm Alicia Sandoval from Copper County News. We'd like to do a story on your sanctuary and the community effort to rebuild after the fire. Would you be willing to speak with us?" Jake hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm not much for cameras." "It's important, Jake," Maria interrupted, stepping closer. "People need to know what's happening here. Not just the fire, but the sanctuary, the wild horse rescue efforts, and the threat of development. Public opinion could make all the difference with the commission vote next week." Commissioner Vasquez nodded agreement. "The more attention on this valley and what it means to the community, the harder it will be for my colleagues to approve those zoning changes in good conscience." Jake looked around at the gathering crowd, neighbors he hadn't known a month ago, now here to help rebuild what he'd nearly lost. Their presence moved him more than he wanted to admit. Slowly, he nodded. "All right, but I want to show them the horses first. That's what this is all about." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. While the news crew filmed, volunteers set to work repairing fences, clearing debris, and preparing the corrals for the horses' return. Jake spoke briefly on camera about the sanctuary's mission, his voice growing stronger as he discussed the wild herds threatened by poachers and habitat loss. The most powerful moment, captured by the cameraman's steady hand, was the return of the horses to their home. Spirit, first to exit the trailer, stood at attention, surveying the changed landscape with wary intelligence. When he spotted Jake waiting by the corral gate, the Mustang trotted directly to him, nickering softly in recognition. "That's remarkable," Alicia murmured as she watched the interaction. "He really knows you." "We've been through a lot together," Jake replied, stroking Spirit's neck as the other horses were unloaded. "These animals aren't just livestock. They have personalities, memories, individual needs. This sanctuary is about giving them the respect they deserve." The reporter seemed genuinely moved. "And you think the proposed resort development would threaten that?" Jake nodded, his expression serious. "It's not just about my sanctuary. It's about the entire ecosystem. The wild horse herds need this land. The water sources Sunrise wants to tap for golf courses and swimming pools are the same ones that sustain wildlife throughout the valley. Once that's gone, it's gone forever." Commissioner Vasquez stepped forward. "That's why we're proposing an alternative development plan. Ecotourism, focused on the natural beauty of the area. Wildlife viewing, horseback tours. A different kind of economic growth that preserves what makes this valley special." The story aired that evening, leading the local news. Jake watched it with Maria and several others gathered in his small living room, feeling oddly disconnected from the earnest, soft-spoken man on the screen, who spoke so passionately about horses and conservation. Had he always cared this much? Or had Spirit awakened something that had been dormant inside him? By morning, the story had gone viral on social media, picked up by several national outlets with headlines like "Former rodeo star creates sanctuary for wild horses" and "Arizona community fights developers to save desert habitat." Donations began pouring in through a hastily created website, along with offers of volunteer help, materials, and even legal assistance. "This is crazy," Jake said, as Maria showed him the steadily climbing donation total on her laptop. "I never expected this kind of response." "People connect with this story," she replied. "The injured cowboy and the wild horse, both healing each other. The greedy developer threatening their sanctuary. David versus Goliath. It resonates." Jake winced slightly at the characterization. "That sounds like a movie, not my life." "Sometimes life follows the same patterns as stories," Maria said with a smile. "And speaking of which, have you seen what Dawson's been up to?" She pulled up a press release from Sunrise Development Corporation. In it, Dawson forcefully denied any connection to the fire, expressed concern for the affected wildlife, and, most surprisingly, announced modifications to their development plan to include a wildlife corridor and equine educational center alongside the resort facilities. "He's trying to adapt," Frank Rodriguez commented from where he sat nursing a coffee. "Your story got too big, too fast. He can't fight public opinion head-on." Jake wasn't convinced. "It's just PR. The wildlife corridor is probably the canyon that's too steep to build on anyway, and the equine educational center will be a few sad horses in a paddock for tourists to take pictures with." "Maybe so," Maria agreed, "but it shows he's feeling the pressure, and it gives us something to work with at the commission meeting." The day of the meeting arrived with a sense of nervous anticipation. Jake was surprised to find the courthouse parking lot even more crowded than before, with people holding hand-lettered signs reading "Save Copper Valley" and "Horses, not golf courses." News crews from Phoenix had joined the local station, and several environmental organizations had representatives present. Inside, the meeting room was standing room only, the air electric with tension. Dawson's presentation was noticeably different this time. Gone was the aggressive confidence, replaced by a conciliatory tone and repeated references to environmental stewardship and community partnership. His team presented revised plans showing a smaller resort footprint, preservation of key water sources, and the promised wildlife corridor. The Equine Educational Center was featured prominently, though details remained vague. "We've listened to community concerns," Dawson concluded, his smile strained at the edges. "This revised plan addresses those concerns while still bringing economic opportunity to Copper County. We hope to move forward in a spirit of cooperation." When it was the opposition's turn, Commissioner Vasquez presented their alternative development proposal, a coordinated plan for ecotourism that would preserve the natural landscape while still generating jobs and tax revenue. "We don't have to choose between economic development and environmental preservation," she argued. "We can have both, but only if we start with what makes this valley special, not with what makes the most profit for outside investors." The public comment period that followed was overwhelmingly against the zoning changes. Ranchers, small business owners, environmental activists, and ordinary citizens spoke passionately about preserving the valley's character and natural resources. Several specifically mentioned Jake's sanctuary and the importance of protecting wild horse habitat. When it was Jake's turn to speak, he approached the microphone with more confidence than before. The crowd quieted, many people leaning forward in anticipation. "Last time I stood here," he began, "I told you about my sanctuary and what it means to me. Today, I want to talk about what it could mean for Copper County." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Since that news story aired, we've had over 500 inquiries from people wanting to visit the sanctuary, to see the horses, especially Spirit. People from all over the country, some from overseas. They're not looking for golf courses or luxury spas. They're looking for something authentic, something wild." Jake gestured to the crowd. "The alternative plan Commissioner Vasquez presented isn't just a compromise. It's a vision for a different kind of future. One where we capitalize on what makes this place unique, not on turning it into a copy of every other resort town." He looked directly at Dawson, who sat stone-faced in the front row. "Mr. Dawson's revised plan is a step in the right direction, but it's still built on the idea that what people value most is luxury and convenience. I believe what they really value is connection to the land, to animals, to a way of life that's disappearing. That's what my sanctuary offers, and that's what Copper Valley can offer if we choose wisely today." The applause that followed was thunderous, drowning out the chair's attempts to restore order. Jake returned to his seat beside Maria, who squeezed his hand with quiet pride. After all the public comments were heard, the commissioners recessed for deliberation. The crowd spilled outside, the mood cautiously optimistic. Jake found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, many asking about visiting the sanctuary or volunteering. An hour later, the commissioners returned. The room quieted as the chair called them back to order. "The commission has reached a decision on Ordinance 277 regarding zoning changes in the Copper Valley region," she announced formally. "By a vote of 3-2, the commission has decided to deny the proposed changes at this time." The room erupted in cheers, drowning out the rest of her statement. Jake sat stunned, barely registering Maria's excited hug or the backslaps from the Rodriguez brothers. They had won, at least for now. As the celebration continued around him, Jake spotted Dawson making his way toward the exit, his team of lawyers and consultants in tow. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room. Dawson's expression was unreadable. but he gave Jake a small, grudging nod before disappearing through the door. "Is it really over?" Jake asked Maria as they left the courthouse, blinking in the bright Arizona sunlight. "Not entirely," she replied honestly. "Sunrise will probably come back with a new proposal or appeal the decision. But we've bought time, and public opinion is firmly on our side now. It's a significant victory." That evening, the celebration continued at Jake's sanctuary. Volunteers who had helped rebuild after the fire gathered on his porch and around a carefully monitored bonfire, sharing food and stories as the desert sunset painted the sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. Jake slipped away from the party, making his way to Spirit's Corral. The Mustang approached immediately, no longer showing any hesitation or fear. His coat had a healthy shine, and his eyes were bright with intelligence and what Jake could only interpret as contentment. "We did it, boy," Jake murmured, stroking the horse's forehead. "This is your home now, for good." "He knows," Maria said, approaching quietly from behind. "Animals sense these things." Jake turned to her, suddenly aware of how important her friendship had become to him over these past weeks. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." She smiled, her face softened by the fading light. "You would have found a way. You're more resilient than you give yourself credit for." She leaned against the fence beside him, looking out over the property. "So what happens now, with all those donations and people wanting to visit?" Jake had been thinking about this question for days. "I'm going to do what I said in that meeting. Turn this place into a real sanctuary for both domestic and wild horses. We can use the donations to expand, improve the facilities, maybe hire some staff." He paused, testing the idea that had been forming. "And yes, open it to visitors. Controlled, limited numbers, of course. Educational programs about wild horses, their importance to the ecosystem, the threats they face." "You're talking about exactly the kind of ecotourism we proposed," Maria noted, her expression approving. "Leading by example," Jake agreed. "And there's more. The Rodriguez brothers mentioned their neighbor might be selling a parcel that connects to the wild horse territory. If we could acquire that, it would create a protected corridor between your sanctuary and their natural range," Maria finished, her eyes lighting up with excitement. Jake nodded. "A place where they could come for water and supplemental feed during droughts, get medical attention if needed, but still live wild. Not confined, not managed, just protected." "That's a beautiful vision, Jake." Maria's voice was soft, her shoulder warm against his, as they stood side by side watching Spirit. From reluctant horse rescuer to wild horse conservationist, quite a journey in just a few months. He laughed quietly. "Not the direction I expected my life to take when I bought this place, that's for sure." His expression grew more serious. "But it feels right. For the first time since the accident, I'm not just existing. I have a purpose again." In the gathering twilight, Spirit moved away from the fence to join the other horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. The Mustang had found his place in this unusual herd, neither fully wild nor fully domesticated, but somewhere in between. A bridge between worlds. "He's happy here," Maria observed, "but he could still leave if he wanted to. The broken fence during the fire proved that. He chooses to stay." "Freedom and sanctuary aren't opposites," Jake replied, the realization coming to him as he spoke. "That's what I want this place to be, a sanctuary that respects freedom, for the horses, for the land itself." As the desert night deepened around them, stars appearing in a vast tapestry overhead, Jake felt a profound sense of rightness. The road ahead would have challenges. Dawson and his developers weren't gone for good. The sanctuary would need massive work to realize his vision. and his own physical limitations remained. But he was no longer facing these challenges alone. Spirit raised his head from grazing, looking toward Jake and Maria as if sensing their gaze. In the moonlight, the Mustang's coat gleamed silver, wild and beautiful and free.